we have a panel dedicated to Gayatri Spivak, offering 2 responses to her keynote and her work. And it's a great pleasure to introduce 2 very brave and great scholars. The first one, I will introduce them together. They will talk in a row, 20 minutes each. Then we will leave some space to Professor Gayatri Spivak to answer, and then the floor is to the public. The first speaker will be Ankhi Mukherjee. She's lecturer in English at the University of Oxford and fellow of the Wadham College. Her work crossover Victorian and modern literature, post-colonial studies, intellectual history, and critical theory. She has a book on aesthetic hysteria and a forthcoming book, which is What is a Classic? Post-colonial rewriting invention of the canon, coming anytime out with Stanford University Press. She's curating a book as well on the Blackwell Companion to Literature and Psychoanalysis, and there will be no better response to Gayatri Spivak today. The second speaker is Jamila Mascat, who has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Siena. She teaches in Rome, lives in Paris, and she just got a position at the ICY in Berlin, the Institute for Cultural Inquiry. Her work crossover post-colonial studies, feminist theory, and gender focuses in particular on the relocation of the category of subalternity. She has recently co-edited a book called Femminista Parola, a critical dictionary and intersection between feminist, queer, and post-colonial studies. It is a great pleasure to welcome Ankhi Mukherjee first, and then Jamila Mascat to this wonderful task. Welcome both.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you, Rosie, and her wonderful Amazonian team for everything. I'm having a terrific time. I'll confirm this after the panel, but I really am. I had a J. Alfred Prufrock moment when I first received the invitation to act as respondent to Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak at the Edward Said Memorial Conference. It's not easy to be sort of an attendant lord to Prince Hamlet Spivak, politic, cautious, and meticulous, as T.S. Eliot says, at times indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. So I thought, in response to the abstract I had received, a borderless world ? I would speak on 3 kinds of borderlessness, drawing broadly on some of the constitutive ideas and ideals of Gayatri Spivak's and Edward Said's work on the topic. So here are my reflections, which focus especially not just on borderlessness, but on the resistance to its triumphalism and implied transcendence. The first kind of borderlessness I wish to touch on is related to what Spivak calls the performative contradiction of capital, and that refers to the globe as the totality produced by processes of globalization. The spatial diffusion and extensiveness of global markets and media give rise to a sense of belonging to a borderless shared world, when the reality is that such developments lead instead to greater polarization and division of nations and regions. Catherine Boo's recently published Behind the Beautiful Forevers, the latest in a series of narrative nonfiction books coming out of India, reminded me forcefully of Spivak's useful formulation of the performative contradiction of capital. The book is set in Annawadi, a slum located near Mumbai's international airport. Its central character is Abdul, a garbage sorter. The other characters are the members of his family and his neighbors. This book, which Amartya Sen describes as a beautiful account of the lives of the precarious and powerless in urban India, sees in the destitute Abdul the figure of difference who fractures from within the very signs that seem to proclaim the emergence of abstract labor. And going back to Bill Grummy's talk yesterday, it is very ironical that he's a garbage sorter, that someone who should extract value from garbage is treated like garbage himself. In fact, people call him garbage. So Catherine Boo, who's a New Yorker journalist, offers alternative accounts of life, death, and hope, to borrow from her subtitle, which challenge hegemonic understandings of modernity and modernization as linked to the global expansion of the capitalist mode of production. The aberrational form of fiction that is behind the beautiful forevers, Catherine Boo's book, helps us re-examine the very ends of the novel: social circulation and mobility, redistributive justice, and equivocal forms of national belonging. The phenomenological border in Boo's book is not between the slumdogs and the lucky 1% in the five-star hotels that loom over Annavadi. Now, Annavadi is a slum which is comprised mostly of migrants fleeing a crisis-ridden agricultural sector, only to find themselves as surplus labor in Mumbai. For every 2 people in Annavadi inching up, there was 1 in a catastrophic plunge, Boo writes. The border then is between the poorer and the poorest. Abdul gains his sense of upward mobility by contrasting his lot with that of his next, less fortunate neighbors, miserable souls who trapped rats and frogs and fried them for dinner, or ate the scrub grass at the sewage lake's edge. The poor, shockingly, want borders and stratification, just like the rich in their unbreached gated communities. It is in fact the construction of a solid kitchen wall between the 2 hovels by Abdul's family that precipitates the calamity that destroys both families. One-legged Fatima, Abdul's belligerent neighbor, sets herself on fire. Thought again of Gayatri. Another instance, perhaps, of what Spivak called the rewriting of the social text of Sati suicide in an interventionist way. This is not mentioned in the novel, but Fatima is a convert to Islam and references her Hinduism. She thinks Abdul and his family discriminate against her because she was a once Hindu. The protest comes to nothing and does not better the life of Fatima as she had intended. She dies of her burns. A small crowd gathers but does nothing, and I'm quoting from the book now. The adults drifted back to their dinners while a few boys waited to see if Fatima's face would come off. Trying to take Fatima to the hospital, her husband finds himself rebuffed by auto rickshaw drivers, worried about the potential damage to seat covers. The poor, Boo writes, blame one another for the choices of governments and markets. Gayatri Spivak mentioned internal class apartheid this morning. What we are looking at in Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers is intra-class apartheid of the classless. So the poor blame one another for the choices of governments and markets, and the poor take down one another as the world's great, unequal, and maximum cities trundle on in relative peace. The second border that I thought I would talk about is that between human and animal. In Jacques Derrida's last seminar, translated by Geoffrey Bennington as The Beast and the Sovereign, Derrida reflects on the obscure and fascinating complicity, this worrying mutual attraction, he calls it, between the beast and the sovereign. If the beast and the sovereign are antipodal in that one is below the law and the other above it, they're also alike in this exteriority. So the beast as king, lion king, the prince as wolf. This obscure complicity is relatable to the creaturely, which Eric Santner defines as, quote, the life abandoned to the state of exception or emergency, that paradoxical domain in which law has been suspended in the name of preserving law. Giorgio Agamben called the creaturely the bare life. Can creaturely life or the bare life offer what Santner describes as a resource for new kinds of social links? In a slightly unrelated note, I would like to mention a sort of double bind that Derrida mentions in this seminar about the lawlessness of law, and I thought this speaks very much to the philosophy of double bind that Gayatri Spivak mentions in relation to her book on aesthetic education. Later in the seminar, Derrida talks of the double bind of the vision of law, that is lawless in its origin. So this is the Derridean double bind. Who will dare militate for a freedom of movement without limit, a liberty without limit, and thus without law? The double bind is that we should deconstruct, both theoretically and practically, a certain political ontology of sovereignty without calling into question a certain thinking of liberty in the name of which we put this deconstruction to work. So deconstruction also is a law unto itself, just as we use it to decode the lawlessness of law. The question then for me was, considering the border between the beast and the sovereign, is the question Santner asks, which is, can the creaturely life offer us a resource for new kinds of social links? As Gayatri Spivak's lifetime's work has enjoined, the subaltern asks for a special form of mediation, maybe even a physical proximity with the object of inquiry through sustained and destabilizing encounters, a critique that is kinesthetic as well as cognitive, embodied if also ultimately at a critical remove. Catherine Boo's book is a culmination of the 4 years she spent in Annavadi, a slum, as I said, behind the airport. Boo's revelatory author's note comes at the very end of the novel, and she says it is because she aspires to invisibility, as if to confer maximal representation to the visible but unseen lives of the Annavadi poor. Spivak, writing on Jane Eyre, this is a very, very famous, we know this argument very well, describes the scene where Jane first encounters Bertha Mason as a situation that made indeterminate the difference between human and animal, so that the narrative could move Jane from the letter to the spirit of the law. 19th century feminist individualism could conceive of a greater project than access to the closed circle of the nuclear family, Spivak writes. This is the project of soul-making. I'm still quoting the lofty Spivak line. This is the project of soul-making. Here the native subject is the object of what might be termed violation in the name of the categorical imperative. So if Jane Eyre can be read as the orchestration and staging of the self-immolation of Bertha Mason as good wife, the counter-reading Spivak offers, the revisionist critique of imperialist axiomatics that Spivak offers, is animated instead by what she calls the intention of saving the singular oppositional, such as the message intercepted in the mode of Bhubaneshwari Bhaduri's Suicide. The impulse of the human, and this is something Derrida writes about in Beast and the Sovereign, the impulse of the human is to turn the trace into a sign, and the trace, in this case the voice consciousness of the subaltern, fights figuration as hard as it can. The only way out, perhaps, is to give it an impossible identification. The term subaltern, which, as Gayatri pointed out earlier this morning, has been grossly misunderstood, or even a negative one, such as Derrida's word animal or animo. The third kind of borderlessness, this I cite with skepticism as well as hope, because it is about the business I am in. In the United Kingdom today, we suffer a peculiar government, which, in the words of Stephen Collini and other educationists, lambasts people for getting into debt, then forces them to take on much more, which goes on about the need for an educated workforce, then makes that education more expensive, which attacks bureaucracy and then introduces an even more cumbersome system for the transfers of money between individuals, government, and universities. The incoherent mess that is the coalition government of policy of higher education is creating a market in higher education that is not only freeing universities to charge higher fees, but is setting quotas for admissions which will eventually make meaningless and farcical any fair access legislations. What is perhaps most insidious, of course, is the way in which the government is interfering in and regulating research. The Independent Arts and Humanities Research Council, a major funding body for the UK academia and arts and the arts, for example, has been instructed to direct a significant part of its funding into 6 strategic research areas which have been defined for it. One of these areas is civic values and active citizenship. A text published a couple of years ago by the British Academy highlighted a Humanities for Business program offering modules to companies like Unilever on topics such as Machiavelli and entrepreneurial success, Rousseau and modern marketing, inspirational leadership in Shakespeare's Henry IV. My point is that the fungible border between humanities research and consultancy work, the fungible borders between intellectual gains and what can be registered on spreadsheets and yoked to direct economic impact, is the corporatized kind of borderlessness that should make us all the more vigilant about the future to come. So, are there any positive, non-coercive models of a borderless classroom? And yes, of course. I mean, we are, and I offer this in a spirit of hero love, if not hero worship. Gayatri Spivak's idea of aesthetic education in her new book, and aesthetic education in the era of globalization, she references Schiller's idea of aesthetic education. Very candidly, she calls it sabotaging Schiller, and in a footnote, of course, qualifying it as an affirmative sabotage. So she is referencing Schiller's idea of aesthetic education as expressed in the 1794 series of letters on the aesthetic education of man, which resonate with Spivak's ideas on public education and pedagogy. And the very interesting thing for me was that she was drawing on Schiller via Demann. And I read a little bit from Demann's wonderful essay, Kant and Schiller. The human is determined by this possibility of free play, hence the need which follows for a free and humanistic, because the notion of free and humanity go together, education, which is called an aesthetic education. Jamila will speak on aesthetic education in great length, so let me proceed to 2 other formulations of a borderless vision of education as perhaps the strongest resource available for the cause of global justice and democracy. And I would like to finish my remarks with references to Said's idea of the borderless classroom. Reflecting on Adorno's use of Lukács to understand Schoenberg's place in the history of music, or Fanon's dramatization of the colonial struggle in the language of the manifestly European subject-object dialectic, Edward Said enjoins us to think of them not simply as coming after Lukács, but rather as pulling him from one sphere or region into another. This sort of non-coercive borderlessness I'm okay with, and I try to emulate in my own teaching and scholarship. This movement suggests the possibility of actively different locales, sites, situations for theory, without, as Said says, facile universalism or overgeneral totalizing. In Adorno and Fanon's impassionate and embodied critiques, the Saidian term for it, as Balibar reminded us, is affiliation. The Lukácsian figure is, to quote Said, both traveling theory and intransigent practice. Edward Said was hopeful about the late 20th century ferment in minority, subaltern, feminist, and post-colonial consciousness that resulted in so many salutary achievements in the curricular and theoretical approaches to the study of humanities. He likened it to a Copernican revolution in all traditional fields of inquiry. However, the effort to deconsecrate Eurocentrism or emphasize the heterogeneity of cultures, traditions, and situations that constitute American culture cannot be reduced, Said warned, to an effort to replace one set of authorities and dogmas by another. Tayeb Salih's Season of Migration to the North, Said said, is valuable not simply because it reinvents the Arabic novel at a time for nationalism and for its rejection of the West, but because, by deliberately recalling and revising Conrad, something impossible for a black man at the time Heart of Darkness was written, Salih's masterpiece enlarges, widens, and refines the scope of a narrative form, at the center of which, and I quote Said, had heretofore always been an exclusively European observer or center of consciousness. For Said, as in Spivak's aesthetic education with its philosophy of the double bind, world literary relations are situated in a field of forces that are productive and that fight tirelessly against all kinds of exploitation. Spivak beautifully put it this morning as accountable efforts. While every reading of a text is not the moral equivalent of a war or a political crisis, it is possible to say, after Said and after Spivak, that works of literature are not merely texts. Thank you very much.
So first of all, let me thank you, Rosie Braidotti, and the staff of the Center for the Humanities for organizing this incredible event, and Sandra Ponsanesi for inviting me here. And then let me say that I'm extremely honored to be here, but I'm also extremely nervous, and I guess you can all understand why. My task is doubly arduous, because I'm supposed to respond to Gayatri Spivak, and I have to follow Ankhi, who already did an excellent job. So, to be honest, I thought it unlikely that my response could be useful, but to avoid being simply useless, I decided, following Spivak's suggestions, to make it abusive, in the very etymological sense of the word, appropriating her word for inappropriate uses that I hope will nevertheless contribute to this discussion. I'll also start with borders. A borderless word, question mark, it's one of the topics that Gayatri Spivak addressed today in her presentation. My own question would be, can we afford a borderless word? Or should we opt for a borderless word? There's a problem with the microphone, it's me? Sorry. Okay. I'm not used to speak from the podium. So yes, my question would be, can we afford a borderless word? The pace at which globalization of markets, media, and migration is proceeding has engendered over the past decades the fictitious reality of a fast and seamless worldwide interconnection, where borders and boundaries are annihilated in the new spatio-temporal dialectic of capital, which, as Marx noted in the Grundrisse, sees every limitation, Grenze, as a barrier, Schranke, to overcome. Spivak has remarked that the very idea of borderlessness displays a performative contradiction. Capital is in fact borderless, but it has to keep borders alive in order for cross-border trade to happen. In other words, capital's all-encompassing borderlessness transcends political borderlines, but at the same time it perpetuates the geographic and economic frontiers that separate the global north from the global south, the periphery from the core, and ceaselessly creates and recreates inner social fences within each of these spaces too. So the peculiar cartography of the world market not only supersedes the topographic space of the state and the system of international relations, but also reveals an inescapable tension between the autonomization of value and the interest of what Marx called individual capitals. Such paradoxical dialectic of borders and capital should encourage us to rethink the meaning and the function of boundaries. If on the one hand, territorial and legal boundaries, national constitutions, and cultural frontiers may seem to embody a form of resistance and antagonism to the unlimited concentration of global power, on the other hand, the desperate emergence of clashing bourgeois nationalism and conflicting identitarianism seem to warn us to handle this idea cautiously. Yet to what extent can the sense of limits, and I'm talking about Grenzen, as markers, lines of demarcation, or front lines, rather than Schranken as barriers. So to what extent can the sense of limits operate as a tool of politicalness and as a claim for justice and radical democracy? Or more specifically, if the legal and economic forms of globalization are characterized by their denationalizing nature, meaning liberation from state sovereignty, global deterritorialization triggers a process of political, ethical, and epistemological crisis which derives from the often merely apparent and/or coercive cancellation of limits and rhythms. I'm not interested in praising limits, defending the cause of limitedness, urging limitation as a synonym for proper behavior. Still less, I'm saying that people should limit themselves, never breaking rules or exceeding limits. I'm strictly referring to the logical and ethical dimension of limitedness as a fundamental and unavoidable condition for action and thought that has to do with what Hegel also called finitude, Endlichkeit, or determinacy, Bestimmtheit, and which, despite of what some of his detractors believe, he always highly valued in both the theoretical and the practical sphere. Thinking reason as will, he wrote in The Philosophy of Right, is reason deciding on its own finitude. Knowing, we read in the last chapter of the Phenomenology, is acquainted not merely with itself, but also with its limits, seine Grenze. And he adds, to know its limit means to know that it is to sacrifice itself. So in that sense, I'm suggesting that precisely the limit could be the excess. Then can we dream of another borderlessness then? Or of an unconditional hospitality, as Spivak suggests, avoiding the danger of shapelessness, that is, avoiding the risk of formalism and indeterminacy. The emphasis shifts to our faculties. Spivak is careful to remind us that today globalization takes place only in respect of capital and data. A similar kind of process denotes the absolute primacy of quantitative abstraction that epitomizes the fetishistic metamorphosis of capital, producing socialization by means of atomization, connection by means of segregation, expansion by means of compression. But what may be, in particular, the epistemological consequences of our exposure to constant, all-pervasive, and homogeneous information flows? To put it in old-fashioned terms, it seems like we're witnessing the opening of an unbridgeable rift between the quantity of data and the quality of desires, between knowledge and will. And Schiller tackled a similar problem in his hate letter on the aesthetic education of men and women. Our age is enlightened, he wrote, that is to say, such knowledge has been discovered and publicly disseminated as would suffice to correct at least our practical principles. How is it then that we'll still remain barbarians? That was Schiller. And in the 9th letter, he addressed the issue from a slightly different perspective to warn that if crisis doesn't also mean kairos, a moment worth seizing for change, the situation then risks deadlock. The edifice of the natural state is wavering, I quote, and there seems to be a physical possibility to put the law, but we may say social justice, upon the throne to finally honor men and women as an end, and to make true freedom into the foundation of a political union. Vain hope, exclaims Schiller, the moral possibility is lacking, and the generous moment, let's talk about the aftermath of the French Revolution, finds an unresponsive people. Thus wrote Schiller at the end of the 18th century. Gayatri Spivak, putting the question differently, notes that the irregular and only apparently accessible contemporaneity of 21st century globalization demands that we ask ourselves how we, scholars, students, teachers, intellectuals, must change once again ourselves, our cognitive mindset in response to the challenge to knowing we are confronted with. For a long time, Spivak's post-colonial critique has warned us against the temptation of epistemic cannibalism, while our politics of translation unmasked the imperialist myth of an absolute proximity. Now, how can the conceptual resources mobilized by a recent paradigm of aesthetic education help us to question the globalization of capital as well as of knowledge. How can the aesthetic education resist the threat of global borderlessness and contribute to what she calls a productive undoing of the current popular aesthetic, or what should be learned, thought, and desired? An aesthetic education is designed to cause an epistemological change and inaugurate a new ethical practice. As Spivak explicitly claims, it aims to, I quote, train the imagination for epistemological performances as well as for ethical intervention. Schiller noted the paradox whereby to love wisdom, one must already be wise. And the impasse between the ethical and the epistemological dimensions gave rise to the project of an aesthetic education. Thus, Schiller opted for aesthetic idealism against ethical idealism. In Spivak, we come upon an aesthetic materialism, I would say, that uses the tools of deconstruction to sabotage the legacy of modernity and of modern aesthetics. Now, once we think of our contemporary world beyond the rhetoric of the seamless globalization, and we deal with a complex geography that allows no immediate equivalence among its spaces, the pathways of an aesthetic education, in contrast with Schiller's univocal model, must be able to singularize and multiply. And here comes Gramsci. Gramsci may not have had Schiller's project in mind when he reflected on the forms of education of subalternity, but the two notions of Bildung have at least one point in common: the intent to mediate the faculties, to mediate sense and intellect within the individual, in Schiller's case, and within society, in the case of Gramsci. The popular element feels but doesn't always know or understand, Gramsci remarked. The intellectual element knows but doesn't always understand and above all feel. Nevertheless, we would be mistaken to interpret the relationship that Gramsci sees between feeling and thinking, or between activity and passivity, as a dichotomy. For Gramsci, there is no such a thing as a pure activity or a pure passivity, since everybody, I quote again, carries on some intellectual activity, is a philosopher, participates in a conception of the world, hence helps to maintain it and modify it. The point is to further this activity, Gramsci concludes, which is always developed to some degree. Between philosophy and common sense, namely what masses think embryonically and chaotically about the world and life, according to Gramsci, there is neither opposition nor interruption in the end. I don't know what Spivak would say about that. Rather, there is a shared terrain and the possibility, and above all the necessity, of a process of symbolic recomposition. When Gramsci refers to the humanistic education of the subalterns, he foreshadows an operation that is meant to alter the discrepancy that exists in the subaltern's consciousness between action and self-awareness, between their social being and the knowledge of being such. And in this sense, Gramsci's humanism can be likened to the displacement of beliefs onto the terrain of imagination. That was a quote from Spivak, that Spivak has defined as a description of reading in its most robust sense, but also as the irreducible element of an aesthetic education. A second aspect that it's worth remarking is the fact that Gramsci thought out his model of education in contrast to the aristocratic reform of the Italian school system that took place in 1923 and that goes under the name of the then Minister of Education, Giovanni Gentile. Mussolini called it the most fascist of all the reforms. Against the logic of distinguishing between schools for the few and the best and others for the hoi polloi, Gramsci imagined a comprehensive school system drawing precisely on the classical courses, so from elementary school to gymnasium to lyceum. The common school he advocated, characterized by an unlimited intellectual self-discipline and an equally unlimited moral autonomy, would be properly humanistic insofar as it is simply designed to, I quote again, develop in each individual an undifferentiated general culture, the fundamental power to think, and the ability to find one's way in life. To say that in Gramsci's conception, anti-specialist humanism constitutes an instrument of not abstract democracy. Reversing the classical aristocratism of humanities without questioning their classical Eurocentrism, though, humanism becomes here a basic key to access, not a sign of election or exclusion, a means of intellectual emancipation, not the unattainable destination of the intelligentsia. If we reflect on the task of tertiary and post-tertiary aesthetic education at the University of the Global North, where, as Spivak remarked in a 1979 essay on explanation and culture, the humanities run the risk of being caught between the institutional defense of their own survival on the one hand, and, I quote, the tremendous exploitable energy of the freshman English machine as a panacea for social justice, end of quote. Then, in a context like this, what can a pedagogy of the humanities consist of? Following Spivak's definition, the humanities, an arena for cultural explanations that questions the explanation of culture, incarnate the structure that we cannot wish to inhabit, but must be subjected to a persistent critique. That was a mix of quotation, I'm sure you recognize it. Probably inside this whole, we can easily agree about what a critical and radical practice of the humanities might be or already is. I'll just mention a few points. Yes. Make explicit the relationship between the humanities as disciplines and institutions, the culture market, and the global market. Admit complicity. Shake up the Occidentalism of the humanities and try to operate reversal aimed at transferring the humanities from the service of imperialism to the service of far better causes. Uncover the intertwining of universalistic and nationalistic temptations that lie at the heart of all humanism. Uncover the intrinsic belonging of every cultural treasure to barbarism, as it is inseparable, as Said through Benjamin remind us to do. Or multiply the centers, decentralize, make the strategies of invisibilization visible, violate the principle of non-contradiction. In short, as Edward Said put it, give them, humanities and humanists, hard time. In his lectures on humanism and democratic criticism, Said didn't actually propose to save the word with humanities. Rather, I guess, he tried to save the humanities from the word, specifically the Anglo-American word before and after 9/11, and to save them from the US academic establishment's attempt to reduce humanism to a nostalgic and chauvinist cultural ornament. He tried to rescue humanities by dismantling the many claustrophobic meanings within which their role has been unduly fixed, not a canon, not a sanctuary to be protected, not an enclosure, not a property. And I would add not even a florilegium or the quintessence of the human. Rather, a battlefield, a dialectic of conquerors, to borrow another phrase of Said's, possibly capable of opening up a perfectible, universalizable, and humanizable horizon. But again, it's hard to say what the humanities can do in a material and symbolic universe shaped by the structures of imperialistic, racialized, and patriarchal capitalism in which they are rooted. We are thrust back to Schiller's disarming remark, to love wisdom one has to be wise already. Spivak suggests that we can find in literature our pharmacon, at once poison and remedy. We find no guarantee in literature, only an encouraging attractiveness that's due precisely to the peculiar relationship that literatures establish with Grenze, borders. The languages of literatures, hence linguistic diversity, national literatures and their collective imaginaries, translations of literatures, all refer to experience of relating to borders and boundaries, through which emerges a unique tension between literature's universalistic and boundless calling and its ineffaceable singularity, givenness, and limitedness. In this sense, as Spivak clearly states, literature don't solve problems. They may create problem solvers by exposing their readers, and perhaps illiterates too, to disorienting encounters with limits, tangles, foreclusions, and displacement that occur in the social world and cross back through textuality without finding in it a solution. I guess we may say now, without being abusive, that literature, by making possible the singular experience of being suspended in the other's text, consign us to a complicated and unique relationship with borders that serve as both aesthetic and ethical training. Imagination may operate as a mode and a medium in which literature gives us the experience of that irregular and only apparently accessible contemporaneity that Spivak speaks of. By exposing us to the imaginable, or to what we hadn't imagined ourselves but someone else did, or to what it's beyond imagination but nevertheless has already happened. So the terrain of imagination may correspond to the, I quote from Spivak again, the irreducible difference between what we need and what we can do. where we can locate the space of desires and the time for their rearrangement. Before ending, very briefly, yes, I'd like to address the intricate question of the relationship between the textual and the political moment, or among singularity, globality as it is, and globalizability as it could be. According to Spivak, it seems that we cannot rely on politics alone, and therefore we need an aesthetic education. Not to produce progress or perfection, but rather to produce discontinuity. In fact, aesthetic discontinuity breaks into the field of epistemology to supplement it, just as ethics interrupts and supplements politics. Far from being impossible, ethics, as Spivak has reckoned, is rather the experience of the impossible. And in Imaginary Maps, she has also warned that, I quote, most political movements fail in the long run because of the absence of this engagement with ethical singularity, end of quote. But what happens to politics and to collectivity and organization that lie at its core when such interruptions occur? How can we recode them? How can we recombine the experience of the impossible, ethics, and the necessity of the possible, politics? I would say that both ethics and politics are matters of desire, though we might be led to believe instead that politics is just a matter of needs. But still, we are on a different scale. Singularity on the one hand, universalizability on the other. From the etymological standpoint, both decision, in Latin decisio, from decidere, to cut off, and critique, in Greek, krisis, from krino, krinein, distinguish, to separate, two fundamental tools of political practice imply a cut, so that any double binds need to be solved into single ones. For this reason, we may conclude that politics can't afford the open series of double binds that only the aesthetic education can maintain. But if class, gender, and race struggles need to be sustained by an aesthetic education, one of our tasks, I suppose, would be then to try to imagine the double bind par excellence between ethical singularity and political generalization. I try to frame it as follows, and I'm done, using Adrienne Rich's words from the Politics of Location, where she states, you cannot speak for me, I cannot speak for us, two thoughts. There is no liberation that only knows how to say I, and there is no collective movement that speaks for each of us all the way through. But I can also quote Spivak's unrepeatable singularity, which is nevertheless repeated. And so my very last and abusive question would be, what's to be done, or what will have had to be done? But I know you don't like this kind of question. Thank you.
From here, right? Said Rosie? From here. Yeah, sure. What kind of, how long? I never asked. 20 minutes, oh, very good, okay. So, cut to the chase. First of all, it's not really this thing, the performative contradiction of capital to keep borders alive. It's not a distinction between North and South at all. Because there's also, for example, anybody who does finance capital, that sector which is very important, currency trading, George Soros, knows that there's a distinction between dollar and euro dollar. That's hardly global North and South. There's a distinction between yen and dollar, hardly global North and South. We have to forget that one. It's really not based on that, get rid of Occidentalism and all that stuff. That's what I was saying, that we can't work on that one. We have to rethink simultaneity. It's hard, it's counterintuitive. Because there's racism on the ground, there are walls. But on the other hand, it's really something that we have to think about. It's also heliocentric time. The stock exchanges close in the United States, they open in Tokyo. That's got nothing to do with North and South. There is North in the South. That's the whole thing that we have to think about. So that's the performative contradiction I was talking about, that the difference among currencies have to be kept alive in order for finance capital, which turns around many times more than world trade, and world trade has been itself spectralized through derivatives and futures and so on and so forth. This is what I was talking about when I talked about the performative contradiction of the most important part of capital, and we've got to think about it. Now, the humanities, Jamila, as you were talking about, they do not exist, the humanities that I was talking about. This is why I said, in the book, Aesthetic Education, I say again and again, the question of what can humanities do? Nothing. In the book, in the current conjuncture, I say again and again, I'm obliged to say this because I believe it's correct, but I have no hope. I repeat, no hope. I do not think that that book is actually laying out a formula about what, I mean, think about how impractical that remark would be, that the teaching of literature can undo this Leviathan, this machine. I mean, how ridiculous is that remark, especially given that it's within the universities. And I'll tell you something, and everything that I've written before 1986 has to be thought through in terms of the fact that I entered the text of this new learning, the education of Gayatri Spivak, the opening up into this other space. And in that space, what is the humanities teaching? Teaching of poetry? No, it's the poetry of the decimal system. As to, if I see, I have 20 minutes, so I cannot tell you how and why. But it's I didn't know what to do with the humanities training. I learned as I went along, and I have not learned it yet. I say to the damn teachers, you know, when you teach, and because your idea of this cruel teaching with class apartheid is that education is knowing the answers to the questions, I tell you that you should ask, if your students can't say what you say you've explained, you have not taught. Same thing is true of me. I cannot teach you. So therefore, the situation there does not prove a damn thing about what literature can do. My answer is nothing. But on the other hand, the fact that it can now do nothing does, I mean, it really is very luxurious to think that it can. Gramsci, on the other hand, and Etienne, you know what I'm going to say. Are you still here? Yes, no. Is he here? Yes. Okay, there you go. Okay, you know what I'm going to say. Because of, I mean, Gramsci is in the prison notebooks, is writing to himself. And so there has to be it's not Togliatti's Gramsci that we have to really look at because of the way it's been cut up. When a distinction has to be made between Gramsci's reaction to the reforms, the Gentile reforms and so on in Italy, the common schools, and what Gramsci, and though they are separated, sometimes one paragraph with the word etc. at the end, which Togliatti cuts off and takes the paragraph and puts it in the middle of something that's called the intellectuals, which actually in Gramsci's notebooks does not have that title. So in Gramsci, when he talks about the production of the subaltern intellectual, it is related but separate from the common school stuff. And what does he talk about there? He's talking on the model of master-disciple, yeah? And the disciple is the intellectual, the new intellectual, who learns from the environment in order, this is, I mean, I never realized that when I started teaching Gramsci again, I mean, obviously I've been teaching him forever since I've been since I've been teaching for so long, but just a couple of years ago, I realized, my God, sitting in his prison cell, the damn man could think what I needed to be in the field to think. You know, his question about the educational reform is it obliged to produce the oligarchical mindset? Remember, Gramsci thought even Marx's project was epistemological. So the idea, is it possible to separate it from the oligarchical, Gramsci's word, epistemology that it produces? It's a question mark. On the other hand, the production of the subaltern intellectual, master-disciple, and Judith, I think I actually talked to you about this. You see, if one looks at the master-slave area in the phenomenology, one knows that, you know, there comes the master-slave, and then comes, I mean, it's imbricated with the transition from feudalism to capitalism. We all know this, but on the other hand, also the remark that if one actually takes this as a historical thing, then one is cutting oneself off from the movement of the phenomenological movement of the epistemograph, the subject moving. But then comes a break, as we all remember, and then the unhappy soul, and then a whole new section called reason, right? That's the structure. There, what Gramsci does, and we really have to think it through, Gramsci was a very smart man. He moves the master-slave into the master-disciple. What is behind that movement? Fanon also reads Hegel at the end of Black Skin, White Masks. When he, in the middle, the chapter that we all always read, he is really quietly saying no to negritude. Remember, Senghor wouldn't let him enter Senegal. Algeria was his second choice. He moves on to read Hegel at the end, and there also he does the same thing. He turns philosophy into history, okay? But he keeps it as master-slave. He naturalizes the self-sacrifice, which absolutely Hegel does not endorse. But so what? Fanon is a reader. So on the other hand, Gramsci does something else. Gramsci is a philosophically, philologically trained person. Fanon is at the same time writing his psychiatric dissertation. So therefore, what one looks at there is not just Gramsci said this about education. It's a very differentiated thing. Now, the next thing that needs to be said is that the imaginary maps situation, now I'm going to say something which says nothing against Mahashita Devi. She is a very fine writer. Certainly, Pterodactyl is an extraordinary book, but I did not know then, this is why I stopped translating her, but translating Chottimunda, I realized that it really had rather little to do. I do think that literary representation cannot be taken as evidence. So to an extent, although I very much enjoyed Ankhi, your account of the novel, it's really, especially one literary text is not a case study. And also we cannot, just as in conceptual art, architecture and so on, we cannot suddenly go into a pre-critical notion of the artist's intention and forget New Criticism 101 produced at the time of the Cold War, but nonetheless something to be learnt there, because I was taught this by a communist teacher in Calcutta, a radical teacher who was reading the, the Well-Wrought Urn in the 50s, Amal Bhattacharjee, that it was not necessary to buy the Cold War philosophy of separating the artist from his intention, but it was necessary in the double bind to acknowledge that the piece that we were looking at exceeds the intention, declared intention of the artist. This is why literature is not an evidence of politics. So to an extent, the Mahashita's material is fantastic, but her own, I mean, I'm myself, after all, marked with a certain kind of feudality without feudalism. That's the problem with the upper caste Indian, feudality without feudalism. And so at least one can take protection against it, not fully. So therefore, I mean, the work that I do is private sector voluntarism. I'm against that politically. But I cannot now go into how the state is moving forward toward this work, because that's not part of my response to these two fantastic papers. But nonetheless, I will say that imaginary maps belongs to the time when I still thought, and this is why writing wrongs is also wrong, I thought that that's how the Indian Aboriginal and so-called untouchable, the SC/STs, the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, scheduled in the Nehru Mountbatten Constitution quota, that they were like what I was seeing under, where Mahasweta held sway. No, they were kept there, anthropologized as what they were, the pure tribal. Once one of them actually produced something like a democratic judgment. It's too long a story. The actual landowner closed the bloody schools. They were too scared of me. The money was mine. And so therefore, 20 years of my work destroyed. He closed the 4 schools. And I moved on to another section of India, of West Bengal, still backward, and I discovered modern India, which is very, very different, discovery of India in that area. We are Orientalists, Nehru, Gandhi, etc. We are Orientalists. There is an India for us to talk about. This is something that also has to be taken into account. Not only are we not the subaltern speaking, we in fact use Orientalism in order to think national liberation. This is something that you cannot deny, especially in the case of India. But so German Orientalism. So to an extent, therefore, whatever I say in imaginary maps, that has to be taken with a huge pinch of salt, and I'm wrong in righting wrongs when I say that you can learn from the cultural conformity of the subaltern. It ain't like that in contemporary India. That's an artificial thing. So I did want to say that. Another thing that I want to say is that we cannot afford a borderless world. You're completely right. But on the other hand, remember what I said about Israel in the Palestine in preventive detention from post-colonialism, which is a different structure of violence? We have to acknowledge that when we look at walls, and I'm not just talking about Israel, I'm also talking about Arizona. I'm talking about Tijuana and San Diego. I'm talking about many other, I'm talking about Toba Tek Singh. You know, I'm talking about all of the partitions in the world today. When we are looking at those, we must want borderlessness. You know, so they are two different structures of violence. We cannot, of course, in fact, we have to acknowledge that there are, for people who work with languages, what we supplement is the dream of borderlessness, which even a good globalization, which used to be called socialism and which has failed, it's got an ethics-shaped hole, that's even a good globalization needs to be supplemented so that it can be a world. Therefore, all of these ideas of globalizing the humanities is a useless idea. And I would very much recommend Emily Apter's new book on the new performative, What to Do with the Untranslatable. It's a very solid piece of work. She's really tried to think it through as to how we have to be bold enough to know that there ain't anything like globalized humanities. Our role is different. It's collective in the sense not of statisticalization. We are teaching 2 million students. It's a very different way in which to be supplementing, but we don't have that courage anymore. The humanities can do nothing. Those humanities don't exist, especially a literary education is not going to save anything. Now, the last thing that I will say, and have I hit 20 minutes? The last thing that I will say is about data. No, one more thing I have to say, Akhil, because you're sitting here. You know that thing about the three women's texts. It's my, Jane Eyre and all that stuff. It's my most anthologized text. You know why? Because it's a very us and theming text. It's the kind of autobiographical moment that metropolitan migrants, first generation, have when they come to the United States. It's an identity type thing. See, because I had read Jane Eyre a million times, not quite a million times, but certainly 3 or 4 times at home in Calcutta. And this had never appeared to me. But somehow in that autobiographical moment, it emerged, hey, look what's happening, etc. And it's a very us and theming text. The colonized are good, the colonizers are bad type thing. And so it's like anthologized, you wouldn't believe, it's still getting anthologized. But in that, I gave it actually for Edward Said's literary criticism seminar. You remember, Akhil? And the one thing that I do remember in that soul-making thing is that you pointed out, correctly, I never revised it, that it was not the categorical imperative, but the hypothetical imperative. See, that was like, God knows how long ago. It was, what, 81 maybe or something, a long time ago. But since he's here, I had to say it. You were right, but I did nothing about it. So the final thing is about data. Now, we are now doing a database for Kwara State University in Nigeria. It's a new university, right? Kwara State, dependent upon the elections. If the governor likes the university, there'll be money. So my very dear friend Abiola Irele is the provost for the Humanities there, Humanities. And I learned from Henry Chakava, see, remember, I know nothing. I learned from Henry Chakava that he was speaking in a mother tongue. He said, look, I'm not speaking Kiswahili, I'm not speaking Kikuyu. I'm speaking in a mother tongue that was not organized by the missionaries. And so there are 3 sitting there, all 3 with PhDs, but they're just understanding each other 30 or 40%. And I said, my God, Henry, really? Are there many? He said, millions, not millions, thousands. So then Henry and then Simon Gikandi told me that the thing that I said, that these are survivor languages, they're used for elections. It's not just, but what do the colonial disciplines do? It doesn't matter. That's why this global Occidentalism, etc., that's not the point, because these anthropologists and linguists are Africans who are resisting. Disciplinarized into anthropology and linguistics, they cannot think, they think this turf battle, they cannot think that we can go directly now from orality to digitality, that we have to think a new way of programming so that this incredible database of these survivor languages that track the continent will not be like the missionary work of cutting them down to orthography and so on and so forth. In fact, that's already true. Someone who was imperialized by the French says Diouf, D-I-O-U-F. Someone by the English says J-U-W-F. It's the same name. Dipesh Chakravorty and I have the same name, but we spell it differently. It's not necessary to give a regular orthography. So, but this, of course, the missionaries did not know. So to an extent, that kind of work will never be global. Because under globality, first of all, you have to prove to the foundations that this somehow relates to popular education or something, because Africa can only be given from the top, clean water, HIV, AIDS, etc. You cannot do this kind of language research. And one is finding out. So you have to say it helps popular education. No, that's not the point. So the second thing is that and if you want to work on this, you can't say all these languages have to be systematized. That is ridiculous. Because in globalization, we do need, as Ngugi knew, some big languages. Okay, and then the imperial languages for international communication. This is a different kind of project, and this is our project. So, therefore, it's a database, right? Data. Now, data, as I have suggested, you were asking me about quantity and quality. I'm sorry, I'm not a Marxist scholar. I don't know anything about Marx, really. I keep on reading and reading and reading. What I understand without any kind of proper training. No, I've never been in a class that has taught Marx, so you will forgive me. But on the other hand, it seems to me that now the general equivalent is not money, but not even capital, but data. And I've said this before. And so what happens is it loses, like cows lost their cowness for us because they became currency. We no longer ate beef. In the same way, the data, it has lost the human substance, as it were. Excuse me for being so humanist. But you know, the substantiality of data is kind of gone. So to an extent there, I'm not a Luddite, and I'm really not a romantic. I'm not asking us to restore the commodity nature of gold, although ... I'm just saying that take a look at this. So use it as you can. That the language thing is also a database. And by the way, when I say medicine poison, I don't mean pharmacon. The pharmacontic argument is much more complicated. If you look at Plato's Pharmacy, you'll see I'm not doing that. I'm doing something very simple here. So these are some of my responses. Now, let me say the one thing. I am not really for unconditional hospitality. I do talk about unconditional ethics, but in a sense, the Bengali word, not the Sanskrit word, is the Sanskrit word. Arindam Chakravorty will tell me I don't know enough, and I don't know enough. But the colloquial Bengali word, like al-haq in colloquial Bengali, hawk, ahoituk ethics, has more purchase for me. Hetu, reason, you know, rather than condition. It's protecting the fragility of reason in proposing an impossible, unreasonable, reasonless, not irrational, but like that sort of ethics. It's different from rational choice, doing the right thing. That's all I can say. As to whether it's doable, I don't know. And what my mistake with ethical singularity in imaginary maps, because I was still stuck in that web of Maharshita's and Gopi Ballabh Singhdeo's, was not to understand that singularity is universalizability without vulgarized Spinoza, without going to the universal. I'm not the one who's guilty of vulgarizing, it's Harter Negri, who should know better. But at any rate, that's where that one is a little bit of a problem. So I have been very disorganized because these two papers are so strong, but I hope I have said enough that the finance capital does not need to keep global north and global south separate. It needs to keep currencies separate and use heliocentric time, and that languages, that literature cannot do anything in the current conjuncture, but nonetheless this has to be said, that the humanities are not useful anymore, that one can use because of it needs a whole conjunctural thing, that we cannot afford a borderless world, but where there are walls, we must think borderlessness. And finally, that the idea in Gramsci of the production of the subaltern intellectual, a question has to be kept separate with Gramsci's connection, also a question with Latinità and so on and so forth, and also the common classroom. And finally, thank you.